Okay, so we got the slideshow here, and we're going to do dark sky exposure. And in this slideshow, you're going to find out what the best ISO is and the best time for your exposure. And once you know this, you can modify your exposure depending on your goals. You may not want to expose for too long, and maybe your equipment can't guide for decently for a long period of time. Whatever you can adjust it, but you will know what the appropriate exposure is um, overall. So let's get to the next slide. And what is exposure exactly? Okay, exposure is the total amount of light reaching the image sensor. So it's determined only by the focal ratio and the amount of time that you expose for. And this is quantified by the term exposure value. So this is found by taking the logarithmic of base 2 of focal ratio squared divided by the time of the exposure. And so this gives you a number that is related to the power of 2, exponent of 2, and this is why you see exposure values doubled, for example, on your time setting. So what, just to explain a little bit about focal ratio, it's not so much the diameter of the scope as it is the focal ratio, which is the focal length divided by the diameter. So this ratio with a larger scope, if you have the same focal ratio, you're going to have the same intensity of image on your sensor here. So that's something to remember. So it doesn't matter how small or big, it's really the focal ratio. So in fact, your iPhone has a focal ratio of about 2.2, so it's actually a fast lens. And because its focal length is very small also, its diameter and its focal length are very small, giving you a focal ratio of 2.2, which is a fast lens. Now the thing I wanted to point out here was that ISO and gain is not part of exposure. So this is something important to understand. ISO and gain are what you use to amplify the sensor's analog output. If you have a camera with an ISO 100, it's typically unamplified sensor output. If you have 200 ISO, you've got an amplifier of a gain of 2 there basically, where 100 is your native and 200 would be twice that. So this also applies to the gain settings in Astro cameras, although those are graded in decibels, which is another scale. But it's in that scale, you double your exposure for every 6 dB, and usually they're listed in 0.1 dB. So if your gain has say 180, that's actually 18 dB, which is 3 times 6, so that's actually doubled once, doubled twice, doubled 3 times. So it's eight times amplification. Okay, so this ISO and gain is very sensor dependent, and you have to determine it first before you determine your exposure, much like choosing your film before you shoot back in the day. So if you're an older person who's used film, you understand this now. Probably readily, because you had to choose your film based on what kind of photography you were going to do. You put it in your camera, and then the exposure was all about setting your time and aperture. If you read the aperture settings, that number on your aperture dial is actually the focal ratio. Here we are to just describe this ISO gain feature a little bit. And you can see here we have a pixel. This would be a cell in your sensor collecting light, and it's going to produce a voltage. That voltage will be amplified by the ISO setting or your gain setting into still an analog signal, and then it's going to be converted to digital by the A to D converter. So at this point in your chain, you have your basically your raw file. If you basically take this point in your chain, put it into your file, that's your raw. And then most cameras or all cameras will have a DSP, a digital signal processing stage, where they're going to convert that raw into a JPEG most likely, and then put the JPEG on your memory card. So the beauty of DSLRs though is you can capture and save this raw digital file, and that's what you want to use. What's important to understand here is that because ISO and gain is amplifying the value out of the sensor, you're also amplifying its noise. So this is going to create limitations on your imaging. One thing to look at first is the how exposure works. What is a normal photographic exposure? So daytime exposure is based on scene reflectance. And the principle of correct exposure has been derived by photography engineering community, and it's based on research that the average scene reflects 18% of the light impinging on it. And you may have heard of something called an 18% gray card, and this gray card is calibrated to reflect 18% of the light. And you can set your exposure and your white balance by imaging this gray card and adjusting your camera. So this 18% gray is called middle gray, and that is approximately the midpoint in the back of your DSLR histogram, back of your camera DSLR histogram. And the reason why it's about 50% on the histogram is because your image that you take is converted to JPEG, and the JPEG has been stretched in a nonlinear process, resulting in the gray being about the middle of the histogram. So here's a typical histogram. Actually, it's not very typical. You'd be really lucky to get such a perfect histogram. What this is telling you is that you have a very balanced image from the dark areas to the light areas. It's very evenly exposed, and this is usually atypical unless you're taking an outdoor sunny day where everything is, you got natural lighting, natural colors, and it's all balanced out. So the thing to understand about a histogram is it's giving you a graph of number of pixels versus intensity. So this axis is the intensity of the light, and the vertical axis is the number of pixels. So what it's saying is at the low intensity scale, or say the black area, you don't have anything, any pixels containing black. So as you might expect in a daytime exposure. And this high area, if you have it exposed correctly, you're not going to exceed the white either, because well, you don't want to point your camera at the sun, and you're not going to have you're not going to want to lose any information, so you will expose it so that everything falls between the high level values of your camera and the low. So in the histogram, this shows you the ranges. They call this the shadow range, the midtones, and the highlights, and then white. Although some call this the white, and a higher level the highlights. So this will be when you very useful actually in dark sky exposure, because you really need the histogram to set your dark sky exposure. So how do we set the dark sky exposure? We do it based on the noise, and that's why we need the histogram. So a galaxy or nebula is so faint that its light signature barely shows in the histogram and may even blend into the background sky. Of course, these dark sky objects, you can hardly see them. So of course they're blending into the background sky. They're very faint, and you're really trying to get out a very low level of light that basically is peeking through the light pollution in your sky. So the background sky is typically the driving factor, and it's used to determine the exposure. And you'll notice that the predominant light source of what you see in the histogram is the background sky, and we call it noise. And we call it noise because it's something we don't want. Basically, anything in your signal that you don't want is noise. So here's a histogram and an image of the dark sky and a target. And now this image has been stretched like a JPEG, like in the back of your camera. So the dark is amplified a little bit more than the lighter areas, and that's why this background comes out. And it also shows you that the light pollution is there, because if you had a pure black, you would not have any light here, even though you stretch the signal. So we do see some light pollution here, and we have our target, and you can see that it fades into the background like that, the edges of the target. But at the core of the target, it's quite bright and it's coming out nicely. And also we have stars that are well exposed, but then we have some very bright ones, and these are probably saturated. And these are probably hitting the top end of the scale of the camera's histogram, at the white end. So this is something you have to decide when you're exposing whether you allow these bright stars to overexpose or saturate. I like to try to capture these stars without overexposing them, so that I can see the better color. Because what happens is when you overexpose them, they become like a white dot instead of a star with kind of an intense center and maybe some color. So let's talk about the histogram. This is a raw representation of the image and linear representation. And so we see a lot of content here down in the low area, and we don't see anything up here. Well, in fact, what we see is that most of the content of the image is light pollution. This is the light pollution, which is the background sky that you see here, and that's what this is. And the galaxy is a small portion of our image, so the number of pixels containing the intensity values of the galaxy is quite small, so they hardly even show on this graph. So the galaxy will be at its outside edges will be showing at these intensities, and as you get to the core of the galaxy, you'll get up more into these intensities, and then the stars will be up near the top. So because the target and these stars represent such a small part of the image, and the background noise such a large part, this scale is suppressed, and you only see the background. But the target images and the star image values are here. You just cannot see them. But what's important here is this background noise, and this is what we want to set for our exposure. Let's talk about signal to noise. We have our noise here in the background, and we know our signal is really going up even to the maximum with the stars and the core of the galaxy. So this range here from the noise to the top is our signal to noise. And we have to base our exposure on the signal to noise ratio. And in photography, there's two rules of thumb. The main one is 40 to 1 represents an excellent quality SNR ratio. That's what we're going to look for, because the other value they talk about is 10 to 1, but this is not really a very high quality image. This is a comprehensible image, but it's not a high quality image. So we want to make a high quality image, so we want to gain an SNR of 40 to 1. And we consider the background light as noise, as we said, and we place it at 1/40th of the peak. And in photography, they call this noise-based speed. In other words, you're setting your exposure that will give you a certain SNR. So if our peak white is at 90 and our dark is at 90 divided by 40, it means that our dark, we want to set our dark level, or I should say our background noise level, to 2.2% on the linear scale. And if you're using a DSLR, this is stretched a little bit, so you will see that position at 20% of the linear, 20% of the histogram on the DSLR. Here we have a standard DSLR image that's just been brought into Lightroom and no processing. It's showing you a fairly well exposed image of the Eagle Galaxy. Eagle Nebula, and the histogram here is what you would have seen in the back of your camera, and it shows the background noise at about 20%. I have it a little higher here, but that's approximately the region. But we need to know more about the SNR. Typically, we're trying to image faint objects just above the background light. So we need another 40 to 1 of SNR so that the background light and faint DSO structures just above the background light are imaged without camera noise. So we have a nice 40 to 1 in our target, but we need another 40 to 1 from the lowest values, the faint values in the target, to the noise of the camera. So therefore we have a total required SNR of the system, the imaging system, of 40 times 40 to 1, which is 1600 to 1. Okay, so what is that? That's easily calculated into exposure value. So our SNR of 1600 to 1 converts to log 2 1600, which gives us 11 exposure value stops. I wanted to talk about this slide because it's got a lot of information that's related to exposure that we've been talking about. So this is a graph of your output value of your pixel relative to your light intensity. So the CCD is a fairly linear device. So as your light intensity goes up, you get pixel values that go up an equal amount. So this linear graph shows you that the more light intensity, the higher your pixel value, and it's a linear relationship. But what it also shows is that as your light intensity gets higher and higher, you start to lose you start to saturate the imaging system. And it's either the CCD can no longer store charge. The photons come in, but it can't store any more charge, so it just basically it's saturated, it's full, and you cannot get any higher values. Or this could be hitting the top end of your ADC, so you cannot get a value above here. So this is showing you this linear relationship for light intensity to pixel value, and then how it saturates and or overflows or overexposes, you would say, up here. The other thing this is showing you is the SNR. So for example, this could be the intensity of the core of the galaxy at this point here, and here we have a noise, and this would be our background sky noise. This is the the level of the background sky noise. So this is limiting and giving us our signal to noise ratio. Now, if we go to darker skies, this is going to go down, and that's virtually the only way to do that, other than narrowband imaging, where you're going to filter out much of the light, and you can reduce this by filtering out unwanted light. So this SNR is what we're trying to make to set our exposure. And the other thing this thing shows is the dynamic range. Now, this is the dynamic range of the imaging system. So what we have is the maximum value it can represent in light intensity and pixel value, and also at the noise floor, this is all the noise that's in the system, like bias noise, dark noise, anything that quantization noise. All the noise factors create this noise floor, and this is the key issue, is that this noise floor is pushed up as you raise your ISO or your gain. So that's why your dynamic range changes and becomes less, and you don't want your dynamic range going any less than your SNR for your target. So this is important. This is an important concept. Let's talk about dynamic range. So we need a camera that has a minimum of 11 EV stops of dynamic range. As I showed you in the earlier slide, the 40 by 40 to 1 ratio, 1600 to 1, gives you 11 EV stops of dynamic range of SNR requirement. And as I said, you want your dynamic range to be at least your SNR requirement. And there's another stop of a dynamic range required to overcome quantization noise. I'm not going to get into that here, but basically the digitization process creates its own noise, and we call that quantization noise, and it amounts to about 1 EV stop. So we need a camera that is at least 12 EV stops of dynamic range. So remember this, it's an absolute requirement that's true for all cameras. And the 11 EV stops is true for all targets, because you want to have that 11 EV stops of signal to noise for a good image, a good quality dark sky image. So let's look at this dynamic range graph of my camera. It's a Pentax K52. And what we see here is the ISO setting. And if you have an Astro camera, you'll see this as your gain setting. And this is the dynamic range measured in EV stops. So we can see that this camera has up to 14 EV stops of dynamic range. In other words, this is what they call the native dynamic range. And you have 14 EV stops here when you have no gain in your ISO gain stage. And as we pointed out, we want at least 11 EV stops of SNR, meaning we have to have a minimum of 11 EV stops of dynamic range, because this graph includes all noise components. Okay, so we get that here at 800 ISO, and if I wanted, I could go down to 400 ISO and get even more dynamic range for my image. But according to our analysis, 800 is what's required. Here we have our raw image again, and again this is a single image, and it's showing the approximately 20% peak for this background sky, and this is a 8-minute exposure. So my ISO here is set at 800, the sweet spot, and then I found how long I had to expose for to get this at about 20%. And then that's my exposure. So it's 8 minutes. So this is the result of just taking that image and adjusting some contrast. And that's, I haven't done anything else. I just adjusted contrast. I don't use Photoshop. I like to keep things looking as natural as possible. This is a bit red because it's taken with a Astro modified camera that had no IR cut filter, so there's a lot of redness in this. But if you look at it, you can see that there's no noise in this image. You can't see any noise. You're not seeing camera noise. It's a single image, and it's taken at 8 minutes. My scope has a focal ratio of 7. So it's a good image because look, the stars are nice and round, which I've had trouble with lately, but this one turned out very well. So this is the result of the analysis of this slideshow, and we can summarize that. So then the first thing you need to do is you need to find the dynamic range graph of your sensor. You look for the dynamic range that gives you 11 EV to find its ISO gain sweet spot. And then you expose so that the background sky is at 2.2% on a linear histogram, or 20% on a DSLR's histogram. Now that you know how to get proper exposure, you can think about options. You may want to reduce your exposure time by stacking images. And this is because it's very difficult actually to get 8-minute exposures. It requires a very good mount, very good tripod. You need a good seeing and also good guiding. And so in general, we don't have all those factors. And a lot of people take the option of reducing the exposure time but taking more images and then averaging out the images and thereby reducing the noise. So if we have our proper exposure of 8 minutes at ISO 800, we can reduce the exposure time by half, but to make up for the loss in SNR, we have to quadruple our number of images. So we need 4 times as many images. And if we want to reduce it by half again, we have to have 4 times the amount from here to here. So now we have a total of 16 times the necessary images to stack. And again, you may want to boost the ISO, say, to 1600. And again, you'll need 4 times as many images from here to here. So now we have a requirement of 64. So if you were taking 2-minute images at ISO 1600, you're going to be spending a couple of hours of imaging. But you will end up with a result that maybe you couldn't get if you were unable to expose for 8 minutes. All right, so that's the slideshow, and I hope you liked it, and clear skies.